The courtroom was hushed, but the silence was anything but ordinary. Every ear strained, every eye locked on the exchange about to unfold. Justice William Alsup leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a grin that seemed almost rehearsed, like he'd seen this play before and already decided how it would end. It wasn't just a smile, it was the smirk of a man who believed he held all the cards, a man convinced he had the upper hand long before the first word had been spoken. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, a measured stillness in her presence. Her reputation had preceded her, fearless in the halls of Congress, sharp in committee hearings, unflinching when power tried to put her in her place. But here in the echoing chamber of the courtroom, all that mattered was this moment, and it began with a grin. Narrators of history often point to sparks, tiny, dismissible gestures that set entire movements ablaze. This was one of them. To some, Alsup's grin might have seemed harmless, even polite, but to those who recognized its meaning, it was unmistakable. Dismissal, condescension, a performance of superiority. It was the visual embodiment of the message so many have heard in whispered tones or blatant sneers. You don't belong here. You're not enough. But that's the danger of underestimating someone like Jasmine Crockett. For every ounce of dismissal she'd endured, she had gathered strength. For every sneer, she'd built steel. For every attempt to silence her, she had sharpened her voice. And now, faced with the grin of a federal judge, all that resilience was about to be unleashed in a way that would leave even her critics stunned. The air grew heavier, the courtroom's fluorescent lights flickering against stone walls, as though reluctant witnesses themselves. Observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something unusual about to happen. Crockett's eyes never flinched. She met the grin with silence, letting it linger just long enough to turn smugness into suspense. And then, with deliberate grace, she drew in a breath. No one in that room knew it yet, but the next word she spoke would shift the balance. The grin would not last, and what followed would leave the nation buzzing with disbelief, because when arrogance meets dignity, only one survives. And in this room, that truth was about to be proven. To understand why that grin mattered, you have to understand the stage on which it appeared. This wasn't a routine courtroom exchange, some procedural back and forth destined to fade into the archives. This was a collision of two worlds, the entrenched guard of power and the rising voice of a new America. It wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett versus William Alsup. It was about what each of them represented to the millions watching, both inside that courtroom and across the nation. Alsup had built his reputation on sharp intellect and stern authority. To his admirers, he was the kind of judge who didn't tolerate nonsense, who could cut down arguments with a single withering question. But to his critics, that same steel masked a habit of condescension, a tendency to dismiss challengers before they had a chance to fully speak. The grin, then, was more than a facial tic. It was the summation of years of arrogance wrapped in a single expression. And Crockett? She wasn't simply an attorney presenting a case. She was a congresswoman who had fought tooth and nail to earn her seat, who carried on her shoulders the weight of communities long ignored and voices long silenced. Every time she entered a chamber, she carried not just her own arguments, but the pride, frustrations, and aspirations of those who saw themselves in her. That made this confrontation different. Every eyebrow raise, every smirk, every interruption wasn't just directed at her, it was directed at the people she represented. For the immigrant watching at home who had been laughed at for their accent. For the woman told she was too emotional to lead. For the young student who had been underestimated because of where they came from. In that grin, millions saw the familiar shadow of dismissal. And that's why the stakes were so high. Because Jasmine Crockett was not going to let this pass unchallenged. Not here, not now, not when the cameras were rolling and the nation was listening. You could feel it in the courtroom itself. The rows of observers shifted, whispers rippling quietly through the gallery. Even seasoned journalists, jaded by years of hearings and testimonies, sensed they were about to witness something that would leave them scribbling in frantic detail. There was a current in the air, a crackle of expectation, as though history itself had paused to lean closer. And at the center of it, two figures stood in stark contrast. The judge, cloaked in the authority of his robe, leaning into decades of habit, certain that his smile could disarm or belittle. And the congresswoman, standing tall, a quiet storm gathering beneath her composure, certain of something far more powerful, that dignity, once fully unleashed, cannot be contained. But here's the part no one saw coming. That grin, so casually offered, would become the very trigger of his undoing. Because when Crockett opened her mouth, it wasn't just an argument she delivered. It was a reminder, a reckoning, a revelation. And as she began, the grin only widened. That was his first mistake. Long before that smirk curled across his face, Justice William Alsup had been shaping the kind of persona that would make such a moment possible. To understand him and why his grin mattered so deeply, you have to trace the arc of his reputation, the contradictions that defined him, and the role he played in a system where power often mistakes itself for wisdom. Alsup was no lightweight, Appointed to the bench during a time when federal judges carried near-mythic authority, he had overseen cases that tested the boundaries of law and politics alike. His rulings were quoted in newspapers, debated in classrooms, dissected on cable news. He was sharp, decisive, and unafraid to use words that cut. Admirers described him as refreshingly blunt. Critics called him arrogant. Both were right. In his courtroom, attorneys often braced themselves not just for legal arguments, but for verbal jousts. He had a way of leaning back in his chair, narrowing his eyes, and delivering questions less like an impartial inquiry and more like a performance. Some saw theater, others saw intimidation. And it worked. Lawyers stumbled, faltered, bent under the pressure of his sharp wit. To many, this was Alsup's genius, the ability to expose weakness with a single biting phrase. But beneath the acclaim lay something harder to ignore. His critics whispered about the moments when his sharpness turned into dismissiveness, when his supposed clarity became condescension. Younger attorneys, women in particular, often spoke of being cut off mid-sentence, their points waved away before they had been fully made. For those who had experienced it firsthand, Alsup's grin wasn't just an expression. It was a symbol of every time authority had reduced their voices to background noise. And that was the contradiction at the heart of his legacy. A man celebrated for intellect, yet notorious for arrogance. A judge praised for command, yet accused of mistaking control for justice. His defenders argued that firmness was necessary, that the law demanded a certain severity. But those who had sat across from him knew the truth. Firmness can be rooted in respect, but condescension is born from ego. In many ways, Alsup embodied the old guard of American institutions. He represented a generation that believed authority spoke for itself, that those beneath it should accept its judgments without protest. The robe was not just a garment, it was armor, a shield against accountability. And for years, that shield worked. Attorneys hesitated to challenge him, fearing the repercussions for their clients, their careers, their reputations. But what happens when someone refuses to play along? What happens when the target of dismissal has already spent a lifetime pushing back against being underestimated? That was the scenario unfolding in his courtroom when Jasmine Crockett stood before him. It wasn't just his grin that triggered the spark, it was the history behind it. Every smirk he had ever used to silence, every raised eyebrow meant to undermine, every sharp word designed to shrink another voice into submission, all of it hung in the air that day. And when he flashed that familiar grin, he wasn't just confronting Crockett, he was confronting the sum of his own legacy. Observers watching could sense it too. There was something about the way his smile lingered, the way it seemed to stretch just a little too long, as if daring her to falter. It was the old tactic deployed again. Disarm her, throw her off, reduce her before she even begins. He had done it 100 times before, and it had worked. But this time, something was different. Because Crockett wasn't like the others who had stood before him. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation, nor cowed by the weight of his robe. She had faced smirks before, from colleagues, from opponents, from those who told her she didn't belong. And each time, she had turned dismissal into fuel. That was the flaw in Alsup's calculation. In underestimating her, he wasn't just repeating his old habit. He was walking straight into the trap of his own hubris. The very arrogance that had defined his career was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. And that's the tragedy of power misused. It often cannot see its own undoing until it's too late. Alsup believed his grin could shrink Jasmine Crockett. Instead, it would magnify her. What he thought was a smirk of superiority would become the moment people remembered as the beginning of his unraveling. And as Crockett drew breath to speak, the contrast could not have been clearer. The old guard, armored in arrogance, versus the rising voice of dignity, sharpened by struggle. The battle lines were drawn. But who exactly was Jasmine Crockett, and what gave her the strength to meet that grin head-on? Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in courtrooms or congressional halls. It began in neighborhoods where ambition met adversity, where every small victory was hard-won and every setback carried lessons. From a young age, she learned that respect was never freely given. It had to be earned, defended, and claimed, even in the face of doubt. Her upbringing was infused with the quiet determination of those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of the color of their skin, the accent in their voice, or the circumstances of their birth. Her parents had instilled in her a belief that dignity is not a privilege, but a responsibility. They taught her that integrity mattered more than applause, that courage meant standing firm, even when no one else cheered. In school, she excelled academically, but she also became intimately familiar with the weight of being underestimated. Teachers, classmates, even peers in extracurricular settings occasionally implied she was too ambitious, too outspoken, or too different. Each challenge became a lesson, each doubt a stepping stone toward resilience. When she pursued law, Crockett discovered both the power and the prejudice embedded in the system. She navigated internships and clerkships with precision, earning respect, but often battling assumptions. In courtrooms and offices dominated by older, predominantly male figures, she encountered the subtle and overt dismissals familiar to many women of color: the interruptions, the underestimations, the casual undermining. Yet with each experience, she honed not only her legal skill, but also her strategic mind and unshakable composure. Every setback became material for preparation, every glance of doubt a reminder that clarity and confidence could dismantle preconceptions. Her rise into politics mirrored her legal journey. Entering Congress, Crockett did not arrive quietly. She carried the voices of the community she represented: the immigrant families, the working-class citizens, the marginalized who too often had been told their concerns were unworthy of attention. She learned early that to effect change, one had to speak boldly, unafraid of opposition, and always grounded in truth. Her speeches were infused with both intellect and empathy, her arguments a blend of meticulous research and lived experience. And in every hearing or debate, she made it clear she was a force not to be dismissed, a voice for those who had too often been ignored. But it was not only about skill or preparation. Crockett's strength came from understanding herself, her identity, her heritage, and the responsibility that came with her platform. She saw herself in every student who had been told they couldn't succeed, in every worker who had been denied fair treatment, in every immigrant who had been made to feel invisible. That identification was not just inspiration, it was fuel. It gave her a clarity of purpose that transcended ego in politics. When she spoke, she carried both authority and authenticity, a combination that made her arguments resonate on levels far beyond procedural correctness. By the time she stepped into Justice Alsup's courtroom, she had endured years of preparation, struggle, and public scrutiny. She had confronted condescension from colleagues, challenges from opponents, and the constant pressure to perform flawlessly in arenas where mistakes could be magnified into character attacks. Each trial, each hearing, each public confrontation had refined her ability to remain calm under pressure, to read her audience, and to deliver her points with precision. Her presence in that courtroom was the culmination of every experience that had shaped her, every early lesson in resilience, every confrontation with injustice, every moment that demanded she rise above expectations. While Alsup carried decades of authority and precedent, Crockett carried something equally powerful: a lifetime of preparation sharpened by adversity and driven by a moral compass that refused to bend. And yet, even with all that preparation, there was a moment before she spoke when the room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye followed her as she inhaled, steady and unwavering. The smile on Alsup's face lingered, but it no longer carried confidence. Something in Crockett's calm intensity signaled a turning point, a moment when arrogance would meet the weight of unshakable dignity. Because Crockett did not just stand there as a lawyer or congresswoman. She stood there as a culmination of her people, her history, and her identity. And in that stillness, the world could already sense the confrontation had shifted. From a test of protocol to a reckoning of principles, from a performance of power to a demonstration of integrity. Every lesson she had learned, every barrier she had faced, every voice she represented, it all converged in that single moment. And as she opened her mouth, poised to speak, the court could not yet know that what followed would be more than argument. It would be a statement of enduring truth. And in that poised stillness, the first tremors of what would shake Alsup's confidence began to ripple through the room. The first words that left Alsup's lips were calculated, a subtle mixture of authority and derision. He questioned, interrupted, and interjected, his grin still lingering like a shield against any serious challenge. He assumed, as he always did, that his reputation would suffice, that his position alone could unsettle even the most prepared opposition. But Crockett was different. She had anticipated this, prepared for it, and in her calm, measured responses, she began to chip away at his certainty. With each exchange, the tension in the courtroom mounted. The subtle hierarchy Alsup relied on, the unspoken intimidation that often silenced younger attorneys, faltered under Crockett's unflinching gaze. She spoke with precision, her arguments carefully structured, yet delivered with a quiet force that left no room for interruption. Every time Alsup attempted to cut her off, she responded with clarity that forced him to pause, recalibrate, and reconsider. The smirk on his face began to show the faintest cracks. Observers could feel the shift. Those who had walked into the courtroom expecting a routine hearing sensed the atmosphere thickening, a palpable electric charge that signaled something extraordinary was unfolding. Lawyers, journalists, and spectators leaned forward, almost unconsciously, drawn into the tension between the two figures at the front of the room. Every word, every pause, every glance carried weight far beyond the immediate exchange. Alsup attempted to assert control, relying on the familiar tools of sarcasm and rhetorical dominance. But Crockett navigated the verbal terrain like a master strategist. She allowed his interruptions to expose the assumptions behind his questions. She used his sharpness against him, redirecting his energy into revealing the flaws in his logic rather than succumbing to intimidation. Her composure was a weapon honed over years of confronting condescension and prejudice, and she wielded it with calculated precision. The courtroom itself seemed to react to the escalating battle. The subtle shift in posture, the exchanges of glances among observers, even the barely audible murmurs from the gallery reflected the rising tension. Every interruption from Alsup was met with a steady counterpoint from Crockett, each one carefully designed to maintain narrative control and moral clarity. The energy in the room became almost cinematic, a duel not of fists, but of intellect, strategy, and character. And yet, despite the growing evidence that the balance of power was shifting, Alsup remained convinced he could regain control with his authority alone. He pressed harder, leaned forward, and emphasized his points with what he imagined to be theatrical weight. But Crockett had anticipated this escalation. Every move he made only amplified her preparation, giving her more material to dismantle his assumptions without raising her voice. The climax of this section approached not with a dramatic outburst, but with a subtle yet unmistakable moment when Alsup's confidence faltered. The grin that had greeted her at the outset began to waver, no longer a symbol of authority, but a reflection of uncertainty. Crockett's calm dominance contrasted starkly with his visible struggle, turning the courtroom into a stage where the hero's preparation met the villain's hubris head-on. And just as the tension reached its peak, with the room poised on the edge of disbelief, Crockett paused, a deliberate, weighty silence that drew every eye and amplified the anticipation. Everyone could sense that the next words, the next argument, would not simply be a rebuttal, they would be the defining moment, the turning point that would decide whose narrative would prevail. The room held its breath. The nation would soon witness what happens when unshakable dignity meets untested arrogance. Crockett's next words cut through the tension like a sharpened blade, precise and deliberate, each one landing with the weight of truth. The courtroom, which had been holding its breath, seemed to tilt forward collectively, every observer aware that they were witnessing more than a legal argument. They were witnessing a display of intellect, preparation, and moral clarity. Alsup, still leaning forward with that lingering grin, attempted to interject, but Crockett anticipated it. She did not flinch, she did not pause. Instead, she let the silence stretch for just long enough to make the room feel the gravity of what she was about to say. Her first sentence was measured, almost conversational, yet its clarity cut through decades of authority and assumptions. Every word seemed to reverberate against the courtroom walls, each syllable striking at the heart of the arrogance before her. She dismantled his assumptions methodically, tracing the logic of the argument point by point. Where Alsup had relied on authority, she relied on evidence. Where he had assumed weakness, she demonstrated resilience. The audience could almost hear the contrast, the imbalance between a practiced smirk and a lifetime of preparation. With each carefully chosen phrase, Crockett exposed the flaws in his reasoning, not with aggression, but with undeniable composure. Alsup's attempts to regain control became increasingly transparent. He leaned forward, attempted interruptions, even tried to inject sarcasm, but Crockett had anticipated every tactic. She redirected each challenge with calm precision, turning his verbal maneuvers against him without raising her voice. It was a lesson in strategy and presence. The stronger the attack, the more effective her composed defense became. The room's energy shifted dramatically. Observers exchanged glances, some leaning forward, others whispering to themselves, captivated by the unfolding display of intellectual dominance. Journalists scribbled furiously. Social media observers would later note, sensing that every word might become a quote, a clip, a viral moment. The tension was no longer confined to the courtroom. It was about to ripple outward into the world. Crockett's next point struck at a deeper level, touching not just on legal precedent but on principle. She framed the argument in terms of dignity, equity, and representation, values that transcended the courtroom and resonated with anyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. The contrast between her moral clarity and Alsup's faltering confidence became stark. His grin, once a shield, began to crumble, revealing vulnerability beneath the surface of authority. Every pause Crockett allowed, every measured gaze toward Alsup, amplified the suspense. It was as if the courtroom itself leaned closer to hear her words, aware that the story unfolding before them was no ordinary hearing. Each of her sentences landed with the weight of a crescendo, building toward a moment that would not simply silence Alsup, but leave a lasting imprint on everyone present. The climax of her counterattack was not a loud proclamation, but a calculated reveal. She presented the evidence, connected the dots, and articulated a conclusion so precise and undeniable that the room collectively exhaled. Alsup's grin had vanished completely, replaced by a subtle tension in his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had underestimated her preparation, her resolve, and the moral authority she carried effortlessly. The gallery responded in ways both restrained and electric. Observers shifted in their seats, some whispering to one another, others nodding with quiet affirmation. Every word Crockett had spoken resonated beyond the facts. It echoed as a statement of identity, representation, and unshakable dignity. In that moment, she had not just countered the argument, she had reframed the entire narrative, transforming the courtroom into a stage where justice, intellect, and courage converged. And then came the final unspoken moment, the silence that followed the crescendo. Alsup, for the first time in that encounter, could not summon an immediate retort. The pause stretched, heavy with realization. Every observer, every journalist, every member of the gallery recognized the shift. The power dynamic had changed. The hero had not only held her ground, she had prevailed with elegance, precision, and moral clarity. Crockett's words did more than silence the grin. They redefined the encounter. What had begun as a display of authority, meant to intimidate, became a demonstration of preparation, integrity, and the quiet, unstoppable force of someone who refuses to be underestimated. The courtroom absorbed the lesson, and so too would the world outside. Because in that silence, in the aftermath of her deliberate, measured counterattack, the nation could see what happens when arrogance meets dignity, when history meets preparation, and when power encounters truth. And while the courtroom remained still, poised on the edge of awe, one truth had become clear. Nothing that Alsup had expected could withstand the force of Crockett's resolve. The first tremors of the broader shockwave were already beginning to ripple beyond those walls, hinting at the social media storm, the public reaction, and the debates that would follow. But in that courtroom, in that charged moment, all that mattered was the undeniable victory of intellect, preparation, and unwavering courage. And yet, outside, the world had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of this encounter would become. The moment Crockett's words settled, the courtroom remained suspended in a kind of awe, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Observers glanced at one another, processing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. For those in the room, it was already clear. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a demonstration of intellect, courage, and unflinching dignity that would reverberate far beyond the marble and oak of the federal court. Almost immediately, the ripple effect began. Journalists hurried to capture quotes, their pens and laptops recording every word. Social media accounts, fed by live updates and cell phone videos, erupted within minutes. Hashtags praising Crockett began trending. Hashtag Crockett Clapback, dignity wins, justice with heart. Memes circulated, juxtaposing the vanished grin of Alsup with Crockett's composed expression, a visual shorthand for the clash of arrogance and resilience. In the digital world, her argument became an instant symbol, a rallying cry for anyone who had ever faced condescension or dismissal. Political commentators scrambled to contextualize the moment. Analysts debated not just the legal merits of the argument, but the broader implications for representation and authority in American institutions. Some described it as a turning point, a rare instance when the established order had been confronted with both force and grace. Social media influencers and activists amplified the story, framing Crockett as a hero for progress, dignity, and the assertion of historically marginalized voices. Across platforms, her voice became larger than the courtroom itself, resonating with those who saw themselves reflected in her courage. Meanwhile, critics scrambled to reassert Alsup's authority, but their efforts were hampered by the undeniable clarity of Crockett's performance. Even those who had previously admired his intellect could not ignore the visible shift. The smirk that once symbolized control had become a testament to overconfidence and misjudgment. Analysts dissected every gesture, every pause, every nuance of the exchange, noting how the balance of power had dramatically tilted. Within communities attuned to identity and social justice, the moment took on symbolic significance. Immigrants, women, and marginalized groups saw in Crockett's measured response the embodiment of what they had long been told was impossible: the ability to stand unflinching in the face of authority, to assert one's voice without compromise, to transform condescension into opportunity. Conversations across classrooms, town halls, and online forums praised her for turning a tense courtroom moment into a masterclass of resilience and moral clarity. Even celebrities and public figures weighed in. Tweets and statements flooded the internet, each amplifying the lesson Crockett had delivered in real time. Dignity can disarm arrogance, and preparation can outmatch presumption. The courtroom footage became a touchstone for debates about authority, respect, and identity, ensuring that the encounter would not fade from public memory. But beyond social media and commentary, the story began to infiltrate public consciousness in subtler ways. People recounted it at dinner tables, in offices, and in classrooms. It became a reference point for discussions about courage, professionalism, and the power of preparation. The narrative was simple yet profound. Here was a moment when historical authority met the force of lived experience and principled conviction, and the latter prevailed. And yet, even as Crockett received recognition and praise, the unfolding story hinted at a wider, more lasting impact. This was not just a personal victory, nor merely a courtroom triumph. It was a statement to a nation that had too often minimized voices like hers, a message that respect, preparation, and moral clarity could shift even the most entrenched power dynamics. In that quiet aftershock, a truth became undeniable. The moment had already transcended the courtroom. The ripple effect was only beginning. The world outside was waking up to the lesson she had delivered, and the conversation it would ignite was poised to spread far and wide. But for Crockett, the applause and viral fame were secondary. The real victory was in the affirmation of principle, the validation of resilience, and the knowledge that one voice, prepared and resolute, could confront even the most intimidating power. And as the social media storm gathered momentum, one question hung in the air, heavy and irresistible. What would happen next? In the silence that followed the courtroom storm, a deeper truth emerged, one that would outlast the fleeting viral moments and trending hashtags. Jasmine Crockett had done more than win an argument. She had illuminated a principle that resonates far beyond legal chambers. Dignity, preparation, and integrity are forces that even entrenched authority cannot suppress. Her victory was not personal. It was emblematic of what happens when courage meets opportunity, when resilience meets recognition, and when those historically underestimated refuse to be silenced. The courtroom, now emptied of the immediate tension, still carried the resonance of what had transpired. Every observer, every reporter, every clerk present had felt it, the collapse of arrogance under the weight of moral clarity. Alsup's authority had been challenged, not by volume or theatrics, but by precision, calm, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The lesson was unmistakable. Confidence built on ego can crumble. Authority built on principle endures. Crockett's performance became a mirror for anyone who had ever been dismissed. Immigrants who had been told they were outsiders could see her success as a reflection of their own potential. Women who had been silenced or underestimated could feel validation in her poised, articulate dismantling of condescension. Communities long marginalized saw a triumph not just for one representative, but for the idea that their voices mattered, that preparation, integrity, and courage could carve a path through even the most intimidating spaces. And it wasn't only about identity. The moral lesson stretched into a universal principle. Power is not defined by position alone, but by how it is exercised. Respect is not granted automatically. It must be earned, reinforced, and demonstrated. When arrogance is met with dignity, it is not merely challenged, it is reframed. The room, the nation, the world all bore witness to that reframing in action. Crockett's moment became a blueprint for the kinds of victories that endure. They are not loud, bombastic, or fleeting. They are deliberate, strategic, and morally grounded. Every step of her preparation, every encounter with dismissal she had faced in life, every subtle lesson learned from adversity had culminated in this precise, transformative moment. Her triumph validated not only her own abilities, but the power of persistence, patience, and principle. The inspirational takeaway resonated. Courage, coupled with preparation, can dismantle even the most entrenched forms of arrogance. And the impact does not stop at the individual level. It ripples outward, empowering entire communities to believe in their voices, to assert their identities, and to demand recognition where it has long been denied. This is the essence of the hero's journey, reframed in a modern political context. The quiet, resolute force of someone who refuses to be underestimated. For viewers watching, the lesson was clear. The confrontation was more than courtroom drama. It was a reminder that every time someone faces arrogance or condescension and responds with clarity, integrity, and moral courage, they become part of a movement that reshapes perception, inspires others, and affirms the value of dignity. And so, as the dust of the courtroom settled, the moral truth remained. The measure of power is not the size of one's authority, but the strength of one's principles. In every corner of the country, in every home where people felt unseen or unheard, Crockett's victory became a testament to the enduring power of preparation, dignity, and courage. But even as the applause and recognition spread, one undeniable tension lingered. A quiet, almost imperceptible question. How would the world, and those in power, respond to the ripple effect she had unleashed? The courtroom lights dimmed, but the impact of what had just unfolded continued to echo far beyond its walls. Justice Alsup's grin, once a symbol of authority and dismissal, had vanished, replaced by the undeniable force of Jasmine Crockett's composure and intellect. She had proven in real time that preparation, courage, and dignity can overcome even the most deeply entrenched arrogance. For viewers, the lesson was as personal as it was public. Every immigrant who had felt unseen, every young woman told she couldn't lead, every marginalized voice silenced by condescension could now see themselves in Crockett's triumph. It was a moment of validation, a cinematic reminder that resilience and moral clarity are stronger than intimidation and legacy power. And yet, this story was not just about one courtroom battle. It was about the ripple effect that courage can ignite. The world was watching, conversations were sparking, and the energy Crockett unleashed had the power to inspire countless others to claim their space, raise their voices, and stand firm in the face of doubt. Her victory became a call to action, a template for everyone who believes that integrity and preparation can move mountains. So, as the camera metaphorically pans out from the courtroom and the echoes fade, the message remains clear. Don't underestimate your power. Stand firm. Speak truth. Let dignity guide your every move. If you were inspired by this moment, don't let it end here. Share this story. Discuss it. Let the world know that voices like Crockett's, voices of resilience, justice, and principle, are the ones that shape our future. Subscribe to stay connected to stories where courage meets authority, where dignity triumphs over arrogance, and where every voice has the power to make history. Because the fight for respect, justice, and representation isn't over, and together we can ensure it never is.